And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh. And today we're going to embark on the next chapter of Isaiah, which is Isaiah chapter 13. This is part of an ongoing series that I'm doing on the book of Isaiah. I started at the very beginning and we're working our way through it. If you'd like to see the rest of it, I have a playlist specifically for that. But let's take a moment here and talk about where we're at in Isaiah, because this is the beginning of a new section of Isaiah. And to understand what's going on here, I want to step back for a moment and talk about the overarching structure of Isaiah. Now, this is a very subjective thing, and nobody really agrees on how to divide up this book. So as many people as make commentaries on it, that's about how many different ways there are to see the different divisions of the book. But I'm trying to go with something that is probably fairly mainstream as far as the way a lot of people look at this. But to start off with, Isaiah has sort of end caps on it. Chapter 1 and chapters 65 through 66 form this end cap, the last two chapters and the first chapter. They have a lot of similarities between them. I think we mentioned this back when we discussed chapter 1, that it was sort of a greatest hits of Isaiah. Well, it has a lot of parallels to the last two chapters, which kind of round out the story, and they form a bit of a frame of the entire book. And while it is very popular in scholarly circles to see how many ways you can divide up the book, the fact that these two end caps exist and that they are fairly intentional in nature does show us that overall the book is sometimes best understood as a whole rather than as individual sections, that there was at a minimum a final editorial intention to make it into a single work. That being said, there are a lot of theories around how the book is redacted, meaning that different layers of material were added at different times, and this chapter is one of the ones that raises some of those questions. So we start off there with the end caps. Then we have chapters 2 through 5, which don't have a strong thematic grouping to them. Some people have proposed a couple of different ideas that might link them together. I'm just simply going to call those the beginning material. They lead up to chapter 6, which is the one that everybody loves, which is the call of Isaiah, where he has that vision where he sees God on his throne and the altar and the temple of heaven and all that. So that seems to be a major turning point. Chronologically, most people would suggest that has to be the beginning of Isaiah's story, his call as a prophet. Not everybody agrees with that, but that seems to be the most logical interpretation of it. Then we go the part we've just finished here, chapter 7 through chapter 12. This is the story of the four wonderful children. The chapters are all tightly linked to these prophecies about children that will rise up. And then there is a fifth figure that comes up in chapter 11, which is this new growth out of the stump of Jesse. And we end it with a psalm that reflects the Psalm of the Sea that was from the Exodus story. So that's the sections that we've had so far. We're now entering into a new section, which is going to comprise chapters 13 through 23. These are sometimes referred to as the oracles against the nations. I don't like that title so much because I don't think these are all necessarily negative. So I tend to say maybe the oracles about the nations. And in these, he will go through a series of different nationalities and discuss prophecies concerning them. I'll break that down in a moment, but that's what chapters 13 through 23 are all about. Then we come to the next section here, which is chapters 24 through 35. Now, some people would separate out chapters 24 through about 27 as its own unit inside of there, but there's really, again, no agreement on any real thematic material that runs throughout these that really binds them together tightly. There are, of course, repeated themes. It's kind of loosely organized. I'm going to call that the later material. Then we run into this section, chapters 36 through 39, and this is the historical material. This reflects 2 Kings, and it probably was not written by Isaiah himself, but probably was a reflection of official court records of the time or something like that. It's not at all in the same style of Isaiah. It is not written as poetry. It is complete prose, but it reflects some of the most important events in Isaiah's lifetime, particularly the 701 assault of Assyria on the city of Jerusalem. And then afterwards, it tells a story about the visitation of the Babylonians and Isaiah's prophecy that they will eventually be the result of the destruction of Jerusalem, something that is reflected in the chapter we're about to discuss. Then, starting in chapter 40, we go to something entirely different, which is often referred to as Second Isaiah, and it runs from chapter 40 all the way over to chapter 54. It starts with the famous words, "Comfort ye my people." This has a very different feel to it. The poetry is more soaring, it's more interconnected, the poetical units are longer and more thought out. There are less references to historical events in this section than there is in the first parts of Isaiah, and there is no reference to Isaiah himself, or at least not by name. This part of Second Isaiah here, chapters 40 to 54, form our next unit, and many scholars would say that this must have been composed later in the 6th century. Then finally, the last bit of material here is chapters 55 through 64, which are often thought of as Third Isaiah. Some people, of course, would take Third Isaiah all the way through to the end of the book, to chapter 66. For my purposes, I'm just going to say through 64. This is, again, a loosely connected bit of material, and most scholars are now of the opinion that this was written by several people, and they reflect issues that would be of interest to a people that had already returned to Jerusalem and were dealing with everyday realities of life. And so it has more of a very practical effect to it. It seems to accept that there's already an established community back in Jerusalem, and they're dealing with somewhat routine matters. All of this, of course, is too much of an oversimplification, but that is the general understanding of it. Then finally, you come back to chapter 65 to 66, which are the other side of the end cap that seem to reflect back the material that comes from chapter 1. That's the overarching view of the book of Isaiah and what's in it and how it breaks down. So now as we come to chapter 13, what is in these oracles against the nations? Well, we start out at chapter 13, verse 1, with an oracle against Babylon. On chapter 14, the beginning part of the chapter also speaks of Babylon, but then on verse 24, we switch over to speaking of Assyria. This section does not identify itself with the same term for oracle, which is Masa, that almost all of these oracles introduce themselves with. There are 3 that do not use that word, and this is one of those. So chapter 14, verse 24, we switch over to a prophecy about Assyria. In that same chapter, chapter 14, verse 28, we switch again to a new oracle, this time about the Philistines. Chapter 15, verse 1, we have an oracle about Moab. Chapter 17, verse 1, we have an oracle about Damascus, which is also known as Syria. Included with that, the northern kingdom of Israel. Chapter 18 does not introduce itself with the word oracle, but it is about the nation of Cush, also known as Nubia or Ethiopia. Chapter 19, verse 1, we have a new oracle about Egypt, very closely related to Cush. Chapter 20, we again do not have it introduced with the word oracle, but it combines and speaks of both Cush and Egypt together. Chapter 21, we have an oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea. It's generally accepted that this is about Babylon. Chapter 21, in verse 11, we switch there from that oracle about the wilderness of the sea to an oracle about Duma, which is understood to be Edom. Chapter 21 still, just a few verses later, in verse 13, we switch to an oracle about Arabia. Then, in chapter 22, verse 1, we have an oracle concerning the Valley of Vision, which is apparently about Jerusalem. In that same chapter, chapter 22, verse 25, we have this interesting story about a burden, the same word that's used as an oracle, that will actually be cut off. And we'll get to that in chapter 22 because it's a very interesting concept there. I will point it out there because it's one of the only places where this word is used not to mean a prophetic oracle, possibly, but to speak of it as some burden that's actually carried. Chapter 23, verse 1 then ends it up for us with an oracle concerning Tyre, otherwise known as Phoenicia. Tyre being one of the main trading cities there on the coast. This word for oracle, this word Masa, only occurs in this section of Isaiah with two other exceptions. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 6 has an oracle on the beasts of the Negev. That's the southern desert in Israel. Also in chapter 46, in both verses 1 and 2, the word shows up, but again, meaning a burden, meaning something that is carried, possibly, and referring to the false gods Bel and Nebo, who are reduced to burdens that are being carried. Most of the time this word shows up is here in this small section of 11 chapters. And so what does the word mean? The word Masa comes from the word Nasa, which means to lift or carry something. And so some translations actually translate this word as burden. Some translate it as oracle because it seems to be telling a future story about something. But the idea is that this is something that the prophet carries. It is something that is a burden to him. And so the word burden seems to fit well with this idea of something that is carried. And we're going to see a couple of places where he actually uses the regular verb to carry as a bit of a connection to this idea that he is delivering a masa, a burden. An important thing to remember as we read these chapters is that these nations likely never heard these prophecies. There's not any real reason to think they would. Jerusalem was not a world power, and there's no reason to believe that anybody would care much what its favorite prophet said about them, not to mention that transmitting such things was quite burdensome back in this time. So most likely, these nations never heard these prophecies. So we start our prophecies here with a prophecy about Babylon. This is a kingdom that would eventually conquer Judah, but that wouldn't be until about a century after Isaiah's time. In Isaiah's time, Babylon was kind of a minor power. They were under the domination of Assyria, like everyone was. Is this something that is written by the original Isaiah of the 8th century? Or was this an addition by some later editor? Many people would like to put it as a later editor simply because they don't feel that prophets see the future. And so if it's speaking about Babylon, it must be contemporary to when Babylon was a major power. Now, there are a small group of people that don't accept that reading and that try to fit this into an 8th century context. Some have tried to associate this with the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, his efforts as the king of Assyria to subdue a rebellion in Babylon that happened in the 8th century. This would put it in Isaiah's lifetime. And so to do that, they had to be a little creative. I'm not terribly convinced that's what's happening here. It doesn't seem to fit. But now on the other side of the coin too is if this is intended to talk about the Babylon of the 6th century, and how it was destroyed by the Medes, which it seems to be talking about, it also doesn't work well for that. It gives this earth-shaking destruction of Babylon that did not happen. The conquering of the city of Babylon was actually fairly peaceful, with some of the Babylonians welcoming their new Persian overlords, particularly among the religious classes. So it was not this terrible battle, nor did the city of Babylon become a desolate waste, as this seems to imply. This doesn't meet up with history, even if we try to put it to the 6th century. So what is going on here is still a question that people love to argue about. I'm going to presume that this is probably squarely in the time of the original Isaiah. If we can believe Isaiah chapter 39, then some point towards the end of Hezekiah's life, he issued a prophecy that Babylon would eventually destroy Jerusalem. Now, if he did this, then it would make sense that they would have a prophecy about the eventual defeat of Babylon. Although this doesn't really reference Babylon doing anything terrible to Jerusalem, it just seems to be talking about the destruction of Babylon. Now, the other side of this is that this is very apocalyptic in nature. And one of the theories is that this either was a standalone poem that was perhaps just about a prototype stand-in for the world and the world's destruction, or that this was a poem about Assyria and that a later editor or redactor changed it to be around Babylon because that was of interest to them. And that's why historically it does not match what happened to Babylon, but the name Babylon is in it. Any of these theories are possible, and that's part of the fun with this, is we have no information to say who's right on this. All of these speculations come from internal evidence in the text, which is a matter of closely reading the text and trying to put together a set of ideas that are congruent and meet up throughout the text. And scholars frequently disagree and revise on these things, but there is no archaeological evidence or textual evidence for any of these types of editings or redactions. It is purely us looking at the text as we have received it and trying to do detective work as to how multiple authors may have written it and trying to put it in context with what we know of the history, which is limited. And so there is frequent disagreements around when the text would have been composed. All we know for sure is that the text had reached roughly the state we have it in now by around 150 BCE, because that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls have a complete copy of the book of Isaiah that is remarkably similar to our modern copy. It is not exactly the same, but it is remarkably similar. And so the book had taken its shape by then. But what happened before that is mostly guesswork. All that being said, let's get into the text. It starts out here with the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Now, this term, as I mentioned, Masa, is a lifting up, a thing that you carry. It seems to be a technical term that introduces these messages. It's derived from the word nasa, which is to lift. It's probably connected to the phrase to lift up one's voice. You use this same verb for that. Some translations translate it as oracle, others as an utterance, and some translate it as the word burden, which I kind of like burden. It kind of captures it. Robert Alter chose the word portent, which sounds really cool too. Then it goes on to speak of on a windswept mountain, lift an ensign. Now, this word that we translated as windswept, it's a fairly rare word. It means to possibly sweep down flat, to lay something bare. I think windswept is probably the best translation of this, although translations do tend to be a little bit all over the place on this word. It's talking about, again, this imagery of lifting up an ensign or a flag on the top of a mountain. This is a signal that we see repeated throughout Isaiah, sometimes to bring destruction, sometimes to bring redemption. And the word here that is translated as lift is that same word nasa, from which Masa comes. There's most likely a connection here between the two, as Isaiah is trying to make this sort of pattern to how he is prophesying. And it continues on, raise a voice to them, wave the hand for them, and they shall come. And then it has two words which are kind of hard to figure out what we mean by. Raise the voice to them, wave the hand to them, and they shall come, the gates of the volunteers. This first word, gates, we know what it means. It comes from a word which means to open, and the way it's written, it appears to be a plural noun, openings, which gates, openings, yes, that works. But particularly the Septuagint suggests that maybe this should be an imperative verb here, which would match the verbs that we've just had around raising, lifting, and waving, and that would mean open. But unfortunately, that doesn't make any sense here. Open the volunteers. That's one possibility. But then it's followed also by this word that I'm translating as volunteers. It is nadib. Nadib means one who is willing to do something, so someone who volunteers to do something. But it also means someone who acts according to their own will. And so sometimes this word is translated as nobles who have the ability to act according to their will. And so some translations you'll see the gates of the nobles. But the fact is, whether we say the gates of the volunteers or the gates of the nobles, neither one really make a lot of sense in this spot. Are we inviting the gates of the nobles to come? What does that even mean? Some translations try to put this together by saying they will enter in the gates of the nobles, but that really doesn't fit well with what the text says. It says, and they shall come, and then has these words, gates of the nobles. It's a bit of a puzzle what to make of these last two words. Moving on to the next verse, it says, I have commanded my consecrated ones. Also, I have summoned my warriors for my anger. This repeated I here is a reflection of the fact that we have the personal pronoun followed by a conjugated verb, which does not generally need the personal pronoun in front of it. So the I is for emphasis. The emphasis here is that the Lord, who appears to be the one who is speaking here, is saying that he has done this himself. He says, I have commanded my consecrated ones. Also, I have summoned my warriors from my anger, those who rejoice over my majesty. Now, who are these consecrated ones? That's a very good question. And there is no agreement on it. Some place them as the Assyrians and saying that these are the Assyrians who will come in and destroy. Some say that they are the Babylonians. We're not really sure, but this seems to be a mighty army, and it doesn't match up very well with anything historical we know of. And we're going to mention the Medes a little later on, but again, this doesn't match up much with what happened historically with them. It seems to have something of a supernatural flavor to it. And so this whole prophecy is sometimes looked at as being somewhat apocalyptic. A sound of commotion is on the mountains, as of a great people, a sound of a roar of kingdoms, nations gathering. We have here this idea of this gigantic worldwide commotion that's coming up. Nations, plural, are gathering. So we have a very dramatic scene unfolding here. The Lord of hosts mustering a host for battle. Notice the repetition of the word host there. Host or army. The Lord of armies mustering an army for battle. This is the Lord himself that is gathering this army, and it is gathering multiple nations into this army, this giant thing, coming from a distant land, from the edge of the heavens. This is not a nearby thing, and that would fit with Babylon. Babylon was terribly far away, probably much further than anyone had ever traveled, with maybe a few exceptions. Babylon was really the idea of the end of the earth, as Assyria could be considered as well. But these are a faraway people that are being brought in. So we have the idea here of traveling great distance. The Lord and the weapons of his curse to destroy the whole land. This army is being looked at as the weapons of the Lord, the weapons of his curse, and they're going to destroy the whole land. Isaiah does seem to be talking about something that is bigger than the Babylon of his time or even the Babylon of the 6th century. The word for destroy here is actually a homonym for a word that we will see a few verses later that means labor pains. And I think that is intentional, and Isaiah is dealing with dual imagery here, that to destroy the land or to place the land into labor pains. The idea of destruction and bringing forth life as a bit of a dualism here seems to be a little bit of a theme throughout this chapter. He then says, wail, for the day of the Lord draws near, as showed from Shaddai it comes. We need to talk about that a little bit. The day of the Lord is a common recurring theme among the literary prophets, and it is saying here that it is happening. It is coming soon, and it's coming like showed from Shaddai. What does showed from Shaddai mean? Well, I have a whole video on the name El Shaddai and what it means, if you want to dive really deeply into it. This is the only place where Isaiah uses the name Shaddai. Shaddai is traditionally translated as Almighty, and I've said in that other video, I think that there really is no basis for that. The name Shaddai here either means destroyer or it means some type of a motherly, nurturing figure. And so again, we have this dualism. The word showed, as I left untranslated here, can mean either destruction or it can mean a mother's breast. Those are two very different images. If you look at the meaning of El Shaddai, he is deeply tied in that title to the nature of families and offspring. He seems to have a certain amount of a fertility or nurturing role when using that title. However, in later times, the word showed, which also means destruction, became associated with it, and that same title, in a few spots, not very many, but a few spots, seemed to have taken on the idea of destruction. And so Isaiah is playing on that dual meaning here by giving it an interesting twist on this. What does destruction from Shaddai look like? What does he do? We read in the next verse, therefore all hands will be feeble and every human heart will melt. Simple enough imagery. This word for melt is actually the same word that we had back in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 6, where I proposed it might be a meaning there, an alternate spelling for the people that were melting before Israel and Syria. Then we continue on, though. They shall be out of breath. Spasms and labor pains shall seize them. Like giving birth, they shall have birth pains. A man to his neighbor will freeze with fear. Faces of flames are their faces. The way that destruction from Shaddai comes is by having them go into the pains of childbirth. It mixes this idea of a fertility role along with a destruction role. And very interestingly, the ones who go into labor are the men. Their great destruction from Shaddai will be to experience labor pains. This first thing, they shall be out of breath. The only other time that Isaiah uses this word is in chapter 21, verse 3, where it also references childbirth. The basic meaning of the word is to be out of breath. And that makes a lot of sense for anyone who has ever assisted in childbirth or gone through it. That is a very common thing to see, is to be out of breath. We have here spasms and labor pains. Spasms does seem to refer specifically to contractions. It's used consistently to be these things that happen during childbirth. So you can translate this as contractions and labor pains quite easily. Labor pains here, it's used 3 times in Isaiah. It also shows up in chapter 66, verse 7, and chapter 26, verse 17. It also shows up 3 times in Jeremiah, and once in Hosea, and once in Job. Every single time it refers to childbirth labor pains. It is not just any kind of agony. It is specifically childbirth pain. And then this final word here, there's multiple words here for pain here. This final word here, to have pains, it's a more common word. It's used at least 6 times in Isaiah, but it also specifically seems to mean labor pains of a woman in childbirth, which is something that Isaiah talks about quite a bit. Apparently, he was familiar with the process. But note specifically here that I left in the idiomatic Hebrew saying here, a man to his neighbor. It specifically says man here, and that is part of the very interesting verse here, is that it is the men that will experience this pain and agony and contractions that are generally associated with women. They will turn to each other and look to each other, and their faces will be frozen with fear, and their faces will be aflame as they realize what is happening to them. So very interesting, perhaps even almost comical situation there. And he continues on, behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel and bursting anger and burning wrath, to make the land a desolation, and her sinners to exterminate from it. So yes, we have the idea here that this is, the Lord has reached the crossing point of his anger here. The word here, bursting anger, means to cross a boundary, to reach a limit. And so I've translated it as bursting anger, because this is that he has reached his limit and gone beyond that with his anger. So cruel and bursting anger and burning wrath, to make the land a desolation. And it is specifically targeting the sinners. Verse 10 here, for the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not shine their light. The word here, constellations, is an interesting one. It's actually a plural word here that is the word for Orion, which is Kessel. And these Keslim, these Orions, we simply translate as constellations. That maybe the constellation Orion was just used as a generic word for any constellation in the sky. The constellation of Orion is one of the most prominent, but is the brightest constellation in the northern hemisphere. As we look up at the sky, almost everyone knows it and can recognize it. Many cultures have named it different things. Almost every culture identifies it as a human person. Orion is, of course, the hunter. Kessel in Hebrew means the fool, and was actually associated with Nimrod, the great hunter, who was thrown up to the sky for his arrogance. In some ways, it makes sense, since Nimrod is also associated with Babylon, that we would reference his constellation in the sky as the fool. At any rate, we have this idea of the stars in the heavens and their Orions will not shine their light. Another possibility about this is that the Orions might refer to the various constellations of the zodiac, which there are 12 constellations of, and they were a major, important element in keeping time by the stars. The reason there are 12 of them is because they represent the 12 months and the path of the sun through those constellations in the sky. When you're on a lunar calendar, that's a very important concept. Any of those things are possible of what we mean here as we say the stars of the heavens and their Orions will not shine their light. Interestingly enough, Orion itself is not part of the zodiac. It's not in the right spot. But we have here this idea that there are these constellations and stars in the sky that they are not going to shine out their light. And then we have a little chiasm here. Will be dark, the sun at its rising, and the moon will not shed her light. And so this is still just another striking instance of poetry that strikes us as apocalyptic. This catastrophe that is about to overtake Babylon is cosmic. The stars and the moon in the sky are going to go dark, and the sun is going to rise without any light. This is much bigger than anything historical that we could point to. Are we talking about Babylon, or are we talking about something else? It also seems to be that this portion is talking about that particularly the evil will be punished in this manner, and not just simply an entire nationality, but it seems that it is coming in a selective manner. And we continue with that thought in verse 12. I will punish the world her evil, and the wicked their iniquity. Now, world, this Hebrew word, which is tevel, in later Hebrew, it means world or earth. However, in Isaiah's time, it probably didn't mean that. They probably didn't have quite the conception of world like we do. They did not have a mental image of a ball spinning in space like we would with a globe. They'd never seen anything like that. In fact, in Isaiah's time, no one had even seen a map. They weren't invented yet. They wouldn't come around for another century or two. So we're not sure what their view of the world was, but probably not anything like what ours is. The word tevel comes from a root that means to be dry or firm, and might have meant something like mainland. The more common word for land or earth is eretz, and that's not what's used here. The Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament points out this word tevel is frequently used in parallel with eretz in poetry, but they don't seem to mean the exact same thing. Eretz, land, seems to be the opposite of yam, sea, whereas tevel, world, seems to be the opposite of midbar, which is wilderness or unsettled area. That means that tevel probably means something like civilization. There are the civilized areas, and then there's the midbar, the trackless desert areas that exist outside of that. So as we say the world here, I think we're talking about the civilized areas of mankind. And that fits with Isaiah's prophecy quite well. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant, and the pompous pride of the tyrants I will lay low. Now, this word tyrants, it's probably a reference to the king of Babylon. Some of these same words will be used to describe the king of Babylon in the next chapter. He certainly was not viewed as a good guy. The idea that they will be laid low, this is the same word that we had back in chapter 10, verse 33, for hewing down a tree in that section of Isaiah that represented the king of Assyria. It continues on here, I will make a man more scarce than fine gold, and a human than the gold of Ophir. Now, there's two words here for gold that are not our usual words for gold in Hebrew. The first one is paz, which we think means a higher quality of gold, and the other is chetem, which is a type of gold always associated with the place Ophir. It's interesting because Hebrew has multiple words for gold, and they bring them all out in their poetry, and English really doesn't have multiple words for gold. So it's really hard to show the variety of vocabulary that Isaiah is using. Sometimes this verse is taken out of context and misunderstood, talking about the worth of souls, that a man is worth more than gold, but that's not what it's saying here. It's saying that he is hard to find. This is talking about scarcity of the population after this calamity, that the men will be gone, that they're going to be so precious because there aren't any. The proud and the arrogant are being laid low, and there are no men really left. And then things get worse. Therefore, the heavens I will shake, and the earth will be shaken out of her place. We have here words that are associated with earthquakes. And so we have an image of a mighty earthquake that's going to shake the heavens and the earth. And then we repeat the words here, at the outburst of anger of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning wrath. This is the same phrasing that we had back in verse 9. The whole earth will be shaken with this mighty wrath of the Lord. And then in verse 14, and he shall be like a frightened gazelle and like sheep with none to gather them. The imagery here of the men fleeing like a scared animal, like a gazelle, like sheep that are not having any shepherd. They simply scatter. A man will turn to his own people, and a man will flee to his own land. So they are these defenseless animals rather than these mighty warriors of Babylon, like they like to envision themselves. And they are terrified. The people who are in Babylon are going to turn around and run back to their own lands. It does seem to imply that a lot of these people are not from Babylon, that they have gone to Babylon, and that as it is destroyed, they're going to turncoat and run back to wherever they came from, seeking refuge with their own people. Again, I don't know that this is anything historical. We seem to be talking in symbols, which is something that Isaiah does quite frequently. And so what is Babylon? Well, the obvious answer here is what it said. It's the world, and not the historical Babylon. But Isaiah tends to talk about one thing while meaning another. We have the men scattering like gazelles, and then we go on. Whoever is found will be thrust through. Whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Very terrible war imagery as we get into here, that if you don't run away, you're going to die. Now, this word here, whoever is caught will fall by the sword. The word caught, it actually means to especially be carried off, to be snatched out of a fleeing crowd of people. This verb was used all the way back in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 20, when we were talking about a razor that would sweep away the beard. It was the same word. The metaphor is that of a people being captured by an enemy. And that is the fate of those who do not flee Babylon before this happens. And then things get worse. Their infants shall be dashed in pieces before their eyes, will be plundered their houses, and their women raped. Nice little chiasm there of a gruesome thing. The Masoretes were actually quite uncomfortable here with this final word for rape, and they wrote in the margins a little bit more gentle word of lain with that could be read in its place. This is one of the few places where the Masoretes found that scripture was a little too uncomfortable for them. And I find it interesting that Isaiah is not at all afraid to be rather direct about violence against women. These verses are intended to sound terrifying because they are. These are precisely the crimes that these invaders, whether they're the Assyrians or later the Babylonians, that they perpetuated against others. It is simply turnabout, and they will experience the horrors that they have inflicted on others. Now, the idea here that the victims of this will be babies and homes and women, these are the very things that men were expected to protect. And these sheep-like men of Babylon, these frightened gazelles, are impotent to protect the most precious human and material possessions. Going on here, behold, I am awakening the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver and do not delight in gold. Well, the idea here is they can't be bought off. The Medes are going to come. The Medes and the Persian, they're both from where modern Iran is. They actually allied together, the Medes and the Persians, to defeat Babylon under Cyrus the Great. The Bible frequently refers to them as the Medes, even though it was actually the Persians that were in charge. And so, yeah, the Medes weren't really the ones that defeat Babylon. It was actually the Persians, but we seem to get those two nationalities confused quite a lot in the Bible. They show up, the Medes are only mentioned a few times. They show up most frequently in Esther, which has a lot to say about them. Their territory was just to the southwest of the Caspian Sea on the eastern side of the Zagros Mountains. And unfortunately, their history is not known as well as we might like. This is because archaeology really hasn't advanced that much in Iran. And there's just a lot that we don't know about their population. Most of what we know about them comes from other cultures writing about them. And we don't have a lot of texts from them themselves telling their own story. But to complicate things more, in the time of Isaiah, the Medes and the Babylonians were in a bit of an alliance together to try and fend off Assyria, because everybody was trying to fend off Assyria. What did Isaiah know of the Medes? What would he have ever heard of people so far away? It's hard to say. And why would he think that the Medes were fighting Babylon? That, again, is unusual. There's no real good answers for that. But here they are, and they're not going to take money or ransom to turn away. And then we have some more frightening language. Their bows will shatter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. You have to think with these words that this was familiar territory for people that had been invaded by Assyria, that they saw the cruelty that happened in war. And here we're saying that these very people that perpetuate such cruelty would learn about it firsthand for themselves. But still, the words are terribly disturbing. Their eyes not having pity against children. This word for shatter that we have here, their bows will shatter the young men, it's the same word that we used back in verse 16 for the infants that are going to be dashed to pieces. Isaiah uses 3 different terms here for children: as destruction and earthquake, and now war come, the men scatter, and the families are left defenseless. A lot of this chapter really is about what happens after there are no men and their responsibilities have been neglected and the families are left behind to suffer from it. So this fall of Babylon is a pretty horrific idea here. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. This word for overthrow, it's a verb that is always associated with what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not just used for any kind of overthrow. It's got its own special verb. We actually saw it back in chapter 1, verse 7, where we talked about overthrowing like Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited or lived in for generation to generation. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there. This word for pitch his tent, speaking of Arabs pitching their tent. The Masoretic text has Yahel, which means to shine, but that doesn't make any sense here. There are 2 manuscripts, at least, that most people will say are the better reading here, that has Yahal, which is to pitch a tent, with an extra letter in there, an aleph, that seems to have dropped out in some of the texts, and that makes much more sense. But it's interesting, the word that is there, the word for to shine, is the same word that is to give their light that we had back in verse 10, speaking of the Orions. It's a rare word, and it only shows up in like Job 3 times and 2 times in this chapter, and that's about it. So we know it's not right, but it is kind of weird that it was the same word that we had back there for the Orions. It's possible Isaiah is doing something here to connect those 2 ideas by purposely dropping off the aleph from pitching a tent, although I don't quite understand what that connection would be between pitching a tent and stars shining. But we have here that the stars aren't shining and the Arabs aren't pitching tents. And Isaiah somehow manages to use the same verb for both by misspelling one of them. So make of that what you will. The Syriac, the Targum, and the Vulgate all have translations that say pitch a tent. And so it seems like it's got to mean to pitch a tent, even if Isaiah has a bit more creative spelling for the word. We have this thing about that shepherds won't have their flocks lie down there. Now, this next part, we actually connect back to that by using that same verb for, it's a verb that means to have animals lie down. And so if shepherds aren't having their animals lie down there, who is lying down there? And so we have these verbs that connect that part to this part. And quite a menagerie we have of who is going to be lying down there. But the jinn will lie down there, and their houses will be full of owls. The little chiasm here will dwell there ostriches, and satyrs there will dance. Goblins will cry in its towers, and jackals in its palaces of pleasure. The fun thing with Isaiah is he loves to use plants and animals, and the tough part is we don't know what a lot of these plants and animals are anymore. The knowledge of what some of these Hebrew words meant died out before the Bible even did. by the time of the Second Temple period, a lot of people didn't know what these animals were that he was referencing, or these plants that he sometimes references with these interesting words he has, and he references a lot of them. Now, this seems to be a mixture of supernatural and natural animals. The first one here, jinn, this, nobody's really sure quite what it is. It's some kind of a desert dweller that possibly emits a menacing sound, some have suggested. There's a scholar, Charles Torrey, who wrote a book of identifying a lot of these biological entities in the Hebrew, and it's still considered a very authoritative work, even though it's quite old now. And his idea on this is that this word here that I translated as jinn comes from him. It's this word se'im. He relates this over to where this word occurs also in chapter 34, verse 14, and he argues that it means a jinn, the demons of the desert. This, of course, will play a major part in Arabic culture later, and we've just talked about Arabs pitching tents, so that kind of fits. And then the interesting part here, that their houses will be full of owls. Well, the word for owl is hoach, and we believe that it is an onomatopoeia. Halot has a great, interesting entry for it here, where it suggests that it is the eagle owl, which is the bubo bubo. And this is a picture of one here. It's an owl that lives in the rocks of the Negev and is named after its call, hoach. So, yeah, their houses are going to be full of these hoach. And then we have next, the ostriches are going to dwell there. Well, interestingly enough, the word for ostrich, it will be used by Isaiah actually 3 times. It's also going to show up in chapter 34, verse 13, and chapter 43, verse 20. And every time it actually says the daughters of ostriches. We don't know why, but they're always referred to as the daughters of ostriches. We didn't bother keeping that in the translation. We just simply say ostriches because they never seem to say it without that daughter of in there. For some reason, King James decided to translate this word as owls. That seems to be completely wrong. We're pretty sure it's ostriches at this point. Then we have satyrs. This really gets kind of interesting here. How it says this is some type of a demon. It is Sha'yarim, which is a hairy one, a goat demon, possibly a satyr. Satyrs were pretty popular throughout the Middle East, a half goat, half human, demon-like creature. And apparently they know how to dance. One of my favorites here is goblins. I mean, goblins, really. I had to go with that translation. This, again, comes from Charles Torrey. It's what he came up with this. He points out that it's the subject of much conjecture. He says here, it may be remarked finally that this translation, goblins, is unquestionably the one which best satisfies the context in each of the 3 passages where this word occurs. He says the whole verse is given up to the demon tribe, jinn, goblin, the satyr, and in one of the other later passages, Lilith. So the idea here is that he feels that's a great translation for what we're talking about. So yes, goblins are going to be there in its towers. The word for towers here is actually kind of weird. The word that is written there is Baal Minotav, which means in his widows, which makes no sense, that the goblins are going to be in his widows. We have several different ancient versions, though, that reflect a different word that should be there, and we believe that it should be Armenotea, which would mean a fortified palace. In his fortified palaces or towers. That seems to be a better emendation of the text there. So the goblins are going to be dancing in the towers, and the goblins are going to be singing or crying in the towers. The word could also mean sing, which I kind of like the idea of goblins singing, and the jackals in its palaces of pleasure. Now, jackal, of course, the final critter in this passage here is the word tanim, which is the plural word that means jackals, but it is very similar to the word tanin, which means sea monsters, which is where King James Version mistranslates this word as dragon. But it doesn't make sense for sea monsters to be in the desert, as we're clearly talking about here. So we're pretty sure that tanim here means jackals and not sea monsters. The last letter is slightly different on the 2 of them. And then he ends it with the couplet, her time is near to come. and her days will not be prolonged. So when was this prophecy fulfilled? Some would argue that the prophecy was fulfilled in 689 BC, when the Assyrians under Sennacherib sacked and desecrated the city. This event is alluded to in chapter 23, verse 13. It may have been an initial fulfillment of this prophecy, but the reference to the involvement of the Medes in verse 17 and the suggestion that Babylon's demise will bring the restoration of Israel, which happens in the next chapter, indicate that the fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians in 538 would fit better, but the destruction that we talk about in verses 15 through 22 raises a significant problem. The Medes and the Persians didn't destroy the city of Babylon. In fact, it was fairly peaceful, with some of them welcoming them. There was no earthquake involved, and it certainly was not left uninhabited with satyrs and hyenas and jackals and ostriches having a party in its uninhabited city. In fact, Babylon would continue as a city undisturbed all the way through the Second Temple period, and would actually be a larger area where a Jewish community lived than any other area in the world for quite some time. It'd be where the primary Talmud was written. The name of Babylon itself doesn't occur that much in the book of Isaiah. This is the first time we have mentioned Babylon in the entire book. It shows up some 13 times in the book of Isaiah, starting here, and that's compared to 44 times that we reference Assyria and 49 times that we reference Egypt. So comparatively, it's not mentioned as much, but it seems to have this important case here, and it seems that we're not really talking very historically about Babylon, that we're speaking of it in symbols of it being representative of the world. Now, why would Isaiah choose to have Babylon be representative of the world when it wasn't the major power of his time? I'm not sure, but there it is, and that's chapter 13. As we go on to 14, we will still talk about Babylon, and we will talk about the king of Babylon specifically there and what happens to him. If you like this, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much.